not welcome here anymore.
That's right.
The moment the mistress and husband threw the wife and mother-in-law into the rain, they were certain of one thing. That chapter was closed. The wife had no job title powerful enough to fight back. The mother-in-law had no money, no lawyer, no leverage. They stood outside in the downpour, the gate locked behind them, the curtains drawn, discarded like broken furniture, replaced by a woman who had spent months carefully dismantling a marriage from the inside. But the husband had one blind spot, one devastating gap in everything he thought he knew about the woman he had just destroyed. 3 weeks before that rainy night, his wife had been driving home alone at 11:47 p.m. when her headlights caught a dying man slumped against a guardrail on an empty road. Pulse fading, phone shattered, invisible to the world. And most people would have slowed down and kept moving, but she stopped. She stayed. She screamed into the dark for help and used her scarf as a tourniquet until the ambulance came 40 minutes later. She never learned his name. She never asked. That man survived. That man was a billionaire. And that billionaire owned the company that was now, this very week, about to award her husband a $3.5 billion contract that he had restructured his entire life, sacrificed his entire marriage, and surrendered his entire conscience to obtain. Now a long black limousine moves through the rain-soaked street and stops. Not at the husband's office, not at his front door, but directly in front of two women standing cold and abandoned on the sidewalk. The billionaire steps out, and upstairs, the husband sees it all. And what he does next is something no one in that house, on that street, or watching this story could ever have predicted. How far can one act of selfless kindness travel? How quickly can a man's greatest victory become his most catastrophic mistake? And when destiny comes dressed in a limousine to repay a debt, who does it choose to honor? Dear viewers, this story is a powerful reminder that kindness is never wasted. It is always working, even when you cannot see it. You will learn why the way you treat people in their lowest moments defines the height of your own future. Watch to the end and drop in the comments the biggest lesson you take away, and tell us what you would have done differently if you were the wife. If powerful stories like this move and inspire you, subscribe now. There are more stories waiting that will change how you see the world. The rain had started slowly, the kind that whispers before it roars. By the time Dorothy Callahan dragged her second suitcase through the front door and onto the porch steps, it was roaring. The water hit the pavement in thick, angry sheets, bouncing off the concrete like it too was offended by what was happening on this quiet suburban street. Dorothy didn't run from it. She stood at the top of the steps, one hand gripping the suitcase handle. The other pressed flat against her chest, and she breathed. Because breathing was the only thing she could control right now, and she needed to control something. Behind her, the front door closed. Not slammed. Closed. Deliberately, softly, finally. The kind of close that says this conversation is over, and it was never really a conversation. Because she had been married to Richard Callahan for 9 years, 3 months, and 11 days. But tonight, Richard had looked her in the eye, calm, groomed, unbothered, and told her that the house, the accounts, the life, and the future all belonged to him now. That she should take what she could carry, that the lawyers would handle the rest. And beside him, draped against the kitchen door frame, in a silk robe that Dorothy recognized as one she had never owned, stood Vanessa Holt. The woman who had spent 14 months carefully, patiently, and deliberately taking apart everything Dorothy had spent 9 years building. Vanessa had not spoken. She hadn't needed to. Her presence in that kitchen, in that robe, in that house, said everything that words would have only cheapened. Dorothy had not screamed. She had not begged. But she had looked at Richard one final time, long and level, the way a person looks at something they are trying to memorize before it disappears forever. And then she had turned, picked up her bags, and walked out. What she had not expected was that they would also send out Eleanor Callahan, Richard's own mother. Eleanor was 67 years old, walked with a cane since her hip surgery 18 months ago, and had lived in the east wing of the house since Richard's father passed 3 years prior. She had been, in every practical sense, Dorothy's closest companion inside that marriage. The one who sat with her during the long evenings when Richard worked late, The one who taught her how to cook his grandmother's recipes. The one who had consistently chosen Dorothy's side in every argument Richard never admitted he was losing. And so Vanessa had made Eleanor part of the terms. The East Wing would become a home office. Eleanor's presence was incompatible with the new dynamic. Richard had used those exact words, incompatible with the new dynamic, as if his mother were a software conflict rather than a human being who had raised him with her bare hands. Eleanor said nothing when they told her, but Dorothy had seen her jaw tighten. That specific tightening that Eleanor Callahan reserved for moments too painful for words. And she had taken Dorothy's arm at the elbow, and together they had walked out of the front door into the rain. Now they stood on the pavement outside the locked gate, 2 suitcases between them, in the streetlight above flickering, like it couldn't decide whether to witness this or look away. "He'll come out," Eleanor said quietly. Though even as she said it, Dorothy could hear the doubt threading through her voice like a crack in old porcelain. "He won't," Dorothy replied. Not bitterly, not tearfully. Simply, the way you state a fact you've already made peace with. But what Dorothy could not make peace with, what kept surfacing through the cold and the rain and the exhaustion, was the memory of 3 weeks ago. The dark highway, the silver car tilted half off the road, the man slumped against the door, his breathing so shallow she had pressed her ear to his chest just to confirm he was still alive. The 43 minutes she had spent in the dark, her knees on the wet asphalt, her voice breaking as she spoke to a stranger to keep him conscious while the ambulance took its time arriving. She had held his hand. She had told him he was going to be fine. She had meant it. She had never learned his name. She had come home that night soaked through, shaken, and quietly grateful that a stranger was still alive. And Richard had not looked up from his phone long enough to notice that his wife had just come the closest she had ever come to watching someone die. But somewhere across the city tonight, in a room Dorothy had never seen, a man who knew exactly what she had done for him, and exactly what had just been done to her, was already moving. The penthouse on the 44th floor of Callahan Tower had nothing to do with Richard Callahan, but the irony of the name on the building would become clear to everyone involved before the week was over. Gerald Harmon did not look like a man who had nearly died 6 weeks ago. He sat behind a desk the size of a small country, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a glass of water untouched at his right hand, and 3 open folders spread before him, each one containing a name, a background check, and a financial portfolio thick enough to humble most men in any room in America. He had been reviewing them for 40 minutes, but his eyes kept drifting from the documents to the window, where the rain pressed itself against the glass in long silver streaks, running downward like something trying desperately to reach the street below. Gerald Harmon was 61 years old, worth approximately $4.2 billion, and the sole principal owner of Harmon Global Enterprises, a private infrastructure and development conglomerate that in 32 years of operation had awarded exactly 4 contracts worth more than $1 billion. The 5th was sitting in those 3 folders on his desk right now. The 5th was worth $3.5 billion, and the 5 firms shortlisted to receive it had spent the better part of 2 years positioning themselves, restructuring themselves, and in at least one case, dismantling themselves personally to be worthy of it. But Gerald Harmon had not built a $4.2 billion empire by awarding contracts purely on financial merit. He believed, with a kind of quiet, unshakable conviction that only a near-death experience can install in a man, that character was the only currency that never devalued. Numbers could be engineered, portfolios could be curated, presentations could be rehearsed until they were indistinguishable from truth. But what a person did on a dark road at midnight, when there was no audience, no camera, no benefit, and no reason to stop, that was the only data point that told Gerald Harmon everything he actually needed to know about a human being. He reached into the left drawer of his desk and removed a single item. Not a document, not a contract, not a report. It was a photograph, taken from the highway surveillance camera that the County Road Authority had reviewed during the accident investigation. Grainy, time-stamped 11:52 p.m., shot from an angle that caught the road, or the silver car, and the figure kneeling on the asphalt beside it. A woman, her back to the camera, both hands visible, one pressed to a man's chest, one gripping his hand. Her posture bent forward in the concentrated urgency of someone who had decided, without discussion, that this stranger was going to live. Gerald had looked at this photograph every day for 6 weeks. His security team had identified her in 72 hours. His personal investigator had filed a full report in 5 days. He knew her name, Dorothy Callahan. He knew her address, her marriage, her history, the quiet financial dependence that Richard had constructed around her like a cage dressed up as a home. He knew about the 14 months of Vanessa Holt. He knew about the $3.5 billion contract application that Richard's firm, Callahan and Mercer Development, had submitted 8 months ago before the affair had fully surfaced, back when Richard still believed he was building something rather than dismantling it. Gerald had known all of this for weeks, but he had waited because timing, in Gerald Harmon's experience, was the difference between justice and spectacle. And Gerald was not interested in spectacle. He picked up his phone and dialed once. "Where are they now?" he asked without introduction. The voice on the other end, his head of security, a precise and unflappable man named Doyle, answered immediately. "Outside the residence, sir. On the pavement. It's raining." Gerald closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. "Bring the car around," he said. "Buena, I'll be down in 10 minutes. He stood, buttoned his jacket slowly, and picked up the photograph one final time. He studied the woman kneeling in the dark, the one who had stopped when every reasonable instinct would have said, "Keep driving," the one who had held a stranger's hand and refused to let go. And something moved across Gerald Harmon's face that his board of directors had never once seen there in 32 years of meetings. It was not anger, it was not calculation, but it was the look of a man who had made a decision so completely that the universe had no choice but to cooperate. He set the photograph face down on the desk, picked up his coat, and walked toward the elevator. The limousine was already waiting. Dorothy had stopped counting the minutes. She had stopped counting a lot of things tonight. The years she had invested, the sacrifices she had quietly absorbed, the mornings she had woken up early to make a home feel like one for a man who had apparently long since decided he was living in the wrong one. Counting had stopped serving her, so she had let it go. The way you release a rope when you finally accept that what is on the other end is not worth the burn on your palms. Eleanor sat on the larger of the two suitcases, her cane propped against her knee, her silver hair flattened by the rain against her forehead. She had not complained once, but Dorothy could see the way Eleanor's left hand gripped the handle of the cane, knuckles pale, grip tight, and she knew that Eleanor Callahan was not gripping it for balance. She was gripping it because it was the only thing available to hold on to, and holding on to something, anything, was the only way to keep from falling apart completely in the middle of a public street. "Come," Dorothy said, pulling her own coat off and draping it across Eleanor's shoulders. "We'll call a cab. We'll go to Patricia's place tonight." "Patricia lives 40 minutes away," Eleanor said quietly. "Then we'll be dry in 40 minutes, Dorothy replied. But Eleanor's eyes had shifted. Not to Dorothy, not to the house behind them, but to something further down the street. Her grip on the cane loosened, not from relief, but from the particular stillness that overtakes a person when they see something their mind has not yet found the words to process. Dorothy turned. The limousine moved through the rain the way expensive things move through difficult conditions. Unhurried, unbothered, as though the storm had been informed in advance and had agreed to part. It was long and black and immaculate, its headlights cutting 2 clean columns of light through the wet dark, its wheels rolling without urgency toward the exact block where 2 women stood soaked and suitcase-bound on the pavement outside a locked gate. It did not slow gradually. It knew exactly where it was going. It stopped, directly in front of Dorothy and Eleanor. Not across the street, not a few feet ahead, directly in front of them, with the quiet precision of something choreographed by a force larger than coincidence. For a moment, nothing happened. The rain fell. The engine idled. The streetlight above flickered once and then held steady, as if it too had decided this moment deserved full illumination. Then the rear door opened. Gerald Harmon stepped out without an umbrella, without a security escort visible, without any of the theatrical apparatus that men of his stature typically deployed when they wanted to be recognized. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and he moved with the unhurried gravity of a man who had long since stopped needing to perform authority because he simply carried it. His suit was dark, his eyes were steady, and they went immediately and without hesitation to Dorothy. Dorothy's breath stopped. She knew that face. She had not known it on the highway that night, had not recognized it in the dark, had not connected it to any name or headline or boardroom photograph. But she knew it now. In the way the human memory sometimes returns a face, not in the moment you need it, but in the moment you least expect it. And the ground beneath her shifted in a way that had nothing to do with the rain. "Mrs. Callahan," Gerald said. His voice was calm and warm and carried the specific weight of a man who had rehearsed nothing because he had nothing to hide. "I believe I owe you a conversation that is long overdue." Dorothy opened her mouth, but no words arrived. Because the mind, when it is confronted simultaneously with loss and grace, tends to short-circuit in the space between them. It was Eleanor who spoke first. "Who are you?" she asked, not rudely, but with the direct simplicity of a woman who had lived long enough to know that the most important questions were always the shortest ones. Gerald turned to Eleanor with a respect so instinctive it looked like reflex. "My name is Gerald Harmon," he said, and then, after a pause that carried the weight of everything it contained, "I own Harmon Global Enterprises, and 6 weeks ago, your daughter-in-law saved my life." Eleanor turned slowly to Dorothy. Dorothy said nothing, but her eyes filled, not with sadness, not with relief, but with the overwhelming, disorienting recognition that the things she had done alone in the dark, the things she had told no one, the things she had never once considered a transaction, had traveled further than she had ever imagined possible. But 40 feet above them, behind the upstairs window of the house with the locked gate, a figure stood very still. Richard Callahan had seen everything, and the color had left his face completely. Richard Callahan had built his entire career on reading rooms. It was his gift, the ability to walk into any space, assess every variable, calculate every angle, and position himself on the correct side of every outcome before anyone else had finished shaking hands. It was why his firm had grown from a two-man operation in a rented office to a serious contender for the most significant infrastructure contract in the city's history. It was why he had always believed, with the unexamined confidence of a man who had never truly lost anything, that he was always the smartest person managing any situation he was in. But nothing, not one deal, not one negotiation, not one carefully engineered pivot in his entire professional life, had prepared him for what he was watching through the upstairs window right now. Gerald Harmon. Richard knew that name the way soldiers know the sound of a specific weapon, instantly, physically, in the chest before the brain is finished processing. Gerald Harmon was not merely the principal of the company about to award him the $3.5 billion contract. Gerald Harmon was the contract. His signature, his approval, his personal endorsement was the only thing standing between Richard Callahan and the kind of generational wealth that rewrites a family's entire future. Richard had spent 8 months, restructured his firm's entire portfolio, and rewritten his company's mission statement twice, all to impress this one man. And this one man was currently standing in the rain outside Richard's locked gate, speaking with quiet warmth to the woman Richard had thrown out of his house 40 minutes ago. Vanessa appeared at Richard's shoulder. She looked down at the street, and Richard felt her go still beside him. The specific stillness of someone whose confidence has just encountered a fact it cannot absorb. "Is that?" she started. "Yes," Richard said. "Why is he?" "I don't know," Richard said. But that was a lie, because somewhere beneath the panic now rising through his chest like floodwater, Richard Callahan's gift for reading rooms was working perfectly. And what it was telling him was catastrophic. He moved. He was down the stairs before Vanessa had finished her sentence, through the hallway, his hand on the front door, his mind already constructing the explanation, the recovery, the version of events that would reframe what Gerald Harmon had just witnessed into something manageable. He was good at reframing. He had reframed his marriage into an incompatibility. He had reframed his betrayal into a lifestyle decision. He had reframed throwing his wife and mother into the rain as a necessary transition. Richard Callahan could reframe anything, but when he opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, Gerald Harmon looked up at him, and Richard understood with a clarity so complete it felt like a physical impact that there was no version of this that reframing could reach. Gerald did not look angry. He did not look contemptuous. He looked at Richard Callahan the way a man looks at a closed door he has already decided not to open. Not with hostility, but with a finality so settled it required no performance. "Mr. Callahan," Gerald said, his voice carrying easily through the rain, "Mike, I came to inform you personally, as a courtesy, that Harmon Global Enterprises will be withdrawing your firm from consideration for the contract." Richard's mouth opened. "Gerald, Mr. Harmon, if you'll just let me explain the situation. What you're seeing isn't—" "I'm not here to discuss the contract," Gerald said simply. "That decision is already made." He paused, not for drama, but because what he said next was something he had chosen carefully. "I'm here because the woman who saved my life is standing in the rain outside her own home, and I intend to make sure she doesn't stand there a moment longer than necessary." He turned back to Dorothy. "Mrs. Callahan, I have a guest residence at my estate. It is yours and Mrs. Eleanor's for as long as you need it. My attorneys will contact you in the morning regarding your interests. But tonight, please come out of the rain." Dorothy looked at Gerald. Then she looked at Richard, standing on the porch of the house she had maintained for 9 years, in the doorway of the life she had built with her own quiet hands. And she felt something she had not expected to feel tonight. Not triumph, not vindication, but release. The deep, cellular release of a woman who has finally been seen by the right person at the right time. She picked up her suitcase. Eleanor was already moving toward the limousine. But Richard did something then that no one had predicted. Not Vanessa watching from the upstairs window, not Doyle standing discreetly beside the limousine, not even Gerald Harmon, who had prepared for many responses, but not for this one. Richard Callahan walked down the porch steps, crossed the wet path to the gate. She opened it and stood in the rain beside his mother and his wife. Not to stop them, not to negotiate, but because something had cracked open in him in the last 90 seconds, that all his gifts for calculation and reframing could not close. And what had come through the crack was not strategy. It was shame, raw, undisguised, and far too late. "Dorothy," he said, just her name, nothing attached to it, no explanation, no request, no architecture of justification, just her name, spoken in the rain, by a man who had finally run out of angles. Dorothy stopped. She turned. She looked at him one final time. The same long, level look she had given him in the kitchen when this night began. But this time it carried something different. Not anger, not forgiveness, but the quiet, unshakable dignity of a woman who knew, with complete certainty, that she was going to be absolutely fine. "Goodbye, Richard," she said. She walked through the gate. She did not look back. Gerald held the limousine door open, not as a gesture of wealth, but as a gesture of respect. Eleanor stepped in first. Dorothy followed. The door closed with the soft, definitive sound of something ending and something else, simultaneously beginning. The limousine pulled away smoothly through the rain, and Richard Callahan stood at his open gate in the storm, watching the tail lights disappear. A man who had thrown away the one person who had unknowingly held everything he had ever wanted in the hands of the one man whose opinion of him now meant nothing, because the only contract that had ever truly mattered was the one he had already broken. Inside the warmth of the limousine, Eleanor reached across and took Dorothy's hand. Dorothy looked out the window at the city moving past. The lights blurred by rain into long, gold streaks, the streets wide and open and going somewhere. And for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel afraid of where she was headed, because the man sitting across from her had not come with pity. He had come with memory, the memory of a dark road, a stranger's hand, and a voice in the dark that had refused, quietly, stubbornly, unconditionally, to let him go. And that, it turned out, was worth considerably more than $3.5 billion. This story teaches us 3 unshakable truths. First, that cruelty toward the vulnerable always carries a price, and the invoice arrives at the least convenient moment possible. And second, that kindness performed without expectation is the most powerful investment a human being can make, because it earns interest in currencies that money cannot purchase. Third, and most powerfully, that the people you underestimate, discard, and push out into the rain are often the very people quietly holding the key to everything you're trying to build. Dorothy never saved Gerald Harmon for a reward, but she did it with everything she had. And the universe, as it always does, kept accurate records. 6 months after the night of the rain, Dorothy Callahan sat at a window seat in a corner office on the 38th floor of Harmon Global Enterprises. Not as a guest, not as a charity case, but as the newly appointed Director of Community Development, a division that Gerald Harmon had quietly built around her specific gift for seeing people that others had decided were invisible. She had not asked for the position, but Gerald had explained it the way he explained most things. Simply, directly, and without excess. "I have spent 32 years building things," he had told her, "but I have never had anyone on my team who understood, at a cellular level, that the most important thing you can build is a person's dignity." I would like to correct that, Dorothy had accepted, but not immediately, because she had learned, in the months since the rain, that her instinct to say yes too quickly to people who needed something from her was the very instinct that had kept her small for so long. She had taken 3 days, consulted Eleanor, prayed twice, and then accepted with the quiet confidence of a woman who had finally stopped apologizing for taking up space. Eleanor Callahan, for her part, had flourished in Gerald's guest residence in a way that surprised everyone, including Eleanor herself. The estate had a garden. Eleanor, it turned out, had always wanted a garden, but had never lived anywhere long enough to plant one. By month 3, she had claimed a full acre of the south lawn, and Gerald's groundskeeping staff had unanimously agreed that she was now effectively in charge of them. Nobody objected. Eleanor had that quality. Richard Callahan lost the $3.5 billion contract, but that, it emerged, was only the beginning of what he lost. Without the Harmon deal, 3 of his firm's largest investors withdrew within 30 days. Callahan and Mercer Development filed for restructuring by month 4. The house, the one with the locked gate and the drawn curtains, was listed for sale by month 5. Vanessa Holt, whose appetite for Richard had been nourished almost entirely by his proximity to wealth and power, was gone before the for sale sign went up. She left on a Tuesday with considerably less drama than she had arrived, and Richard did not chase her. Because by then he understood, with the devastating clarity of a man who had lost everything he had engineered and kept nothing he had been given, that there was nothing worth chasing anymore. When he reached out to Dorothy once, a single message, 3 sentences long, delivered through his attorney because he no longer had the standing to contact her directly. It said that he was sorry, that he had been wrong, that he hoped she was well. Dorothy read it twice, but she did not respond. Not out of bitterness, not out of cruelty, but because she had learned something important in the months since the rain, that some apologies are not invitations. They are simply the sound a door makes when it finally permanently closes. She wished him no harm, but she wished him no access either, and for the first time in 9 years, the boundary between those two things felt completely clear. Gerald Harmon awarded the $3.5 billion contract 6 weeks after the night of the rain to a mid-sized firm whose principal had, 3 years earlier, and quietly funded a community health clinic in an underserved district with no press release, no tax strategy attached, and no intention of anyone ever knowing. Gerald had found out anyway. He always did. Character, in his experience, left tracks even when it tried to be invisible. But the most significant thing Gerald Harmon did in those 6 months was something that never appeared in any financial publication or business column. He went back to the highway. He stood at the exact spot, the guardrail, the stretch of dark road, the place where a woman he had never met had decided, without hesitation, that his life was worth saving. He stood there for a long time in the quiet, the way a person stands at a place that changed everything, trying to hold the full weight of what almost wasn't. Then he got back in the car, drove to his office, Washington signed the paperwork that established the Dorothy Callahan Foundation for Community Dignity. Fully funded, fully endowed, bearing her name not because she had asked for it, but because Gerald Harmon believed, with every conviction he possessed, that the world ought to know what quiet courage looked like when it had a face. Dorothy cried when he told her, but they were not the tears of a woman overwhelmed by gratitude. They were the tears of a woman who had spent years being invisible and had finally completely been seen. Outside her office window, the city moved in its usual organized chaos. Traffic, ambition, 1,000 private stories unfolding simultaneously in the streets below. And somewhere in all of it, Dorothy knew, there were other dark highways, other moments of choice, on other people deciding in real time whether to stop or keep driving. She hoped they stopped, because the rain, she had learned, was never really the worst part of any storm, but what waited on the other side of it. If you held on, if you stayed true, if you refused to let go of what was right even when everything around you was telling you to simply survive. That was something no storm could ever reach. And that, more than the contract, more than the limousine, more than the locked gate and the silk robe and the calculated cruelty of a Tuesday night in the rain, was the lesson that Dorothy Callahan carried forward into every single day that followed. Not as a wound, but as a light.